have arrived at the Marconi Center in the beautiful little Marin County coastal town of Tamales Bay, and the coast is on Tamales Bay, not the Pacific Ocean. It sits on an inlet that was formed when the San Andreas Fault separated this piece of land to the west of us from the continental United States and created Tamales Bay. But I'm here at the Marconi Center, what's called the Marconi Center, and it's a rather obscure state park. It's obscure in the sense that you'd have to be somewhat a little bit of a history buff and a little bit of knowledge in history and radio and things like that. You know, Marconi, the Italian inventor, following on the heels of Tesla and a few other people, developed the first practical system of transmitting wireless radio signals great distances. Before that, you had to actually have a physical connection between the sender and the receiver. Because of Marconi's pioneering work, for the first time wireless was invented. And although there was a tremendous amount of litigation over the years that carried on long after Marconi's death, involving Tesla and other people, he's generally credited with the invention of the wireless radio. Well, it was very important to be able to transmit and receive signals great distances. So the Marconi Corporation formed a network on the East Coast and the West Coast, 4 big, enormous transmitting stations that could reach across the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean. And you're looking at the residences of the engineers and the operating personnel that was built in 1914 and 15 under the direction and approval of Marconi. Now, the way this operated was that they had a sending and a receiving area that were separated by some miles. They could not have sending and receiving antennas in one location because of the interference from the high power generation needed to transmit a signal out across the Pacific Ocean. So the dual station, you had to have 2 of them, was set up further down the coast at a place called Bolinas down near Stinson Beach. Well, they had an antenna here that stretched for about 1 mile in length, the transmitting, 2 transmitting towers, 270 feet tall. It would blast a signal in 1915 out across the ocean to be able to reach ships at sea. You can imagine what a marvelous this was, to be able to contact ships in the middle of the Pacific Ocean thanks to Marconi's wireless. Well, the story takes a few strange twists. World War I broke out, and there was no way that the United States was going to allow a foreign national to control radio traffic out to and signals out to ships at sea. So the United States Navy in 1917 took possession and seized the properties of Marconi and brought them under the control of the United States Navy. After the war, when they had proved incredibly useful during World War I, after the war, the United States government decided radio propagation, radio control, radio stations were too risky to have in the hands of foreigners, particularly when there was radicals blowing up bombs in New York City and other places in that late 1920 period of unrest following World War I. So the government decided that it had to have an American company that would have ownership, and it would be owned by the American people, an American corporation. So they initially asked General Electric to purchase it, and it actually ended up in 1919. The RCA, the Radio Corporation of America, yes, that RCA, his master's voice, was formed and took control of these operating stations and incorporated them into the RCA network. Well, that's part 1 of the story, and we're going to have a little look around, but the story takes a tremendously sinister An ugly twist beginning in 1958 when RCA sold off a good chunk of this property. Well, we'll get to that in a little bit. Let's see if we can snoop around a little bit. This is the old residence here. It's long since closed down. I'm not even sure if you're allowed to go up there or not. I don't see anything that any immediate indication. And then I believe they have a center here. We can look around a little bit. They have some other buildings on the campus here, some of the original transmission facilities. So if you like history, if you love radio history like I do, and you love kooky California history, well, I got a lot to talk about that too here at the Marconi Center in Marshall, California, in Marin County. Let's get the gimbal and let's take a look around. I mentioned to you guys that this facility, the old Marconi Pacific Wireless Station, had a dark and sinister, too, a brutal one that, well, led to, as well as if you think the bottom of YouTube is brutal, get a load of this story. In 1958, down in Southern California, there was a guy named Charles Dieterich. Charles Dieterich was a person who, although himself not addicted, perhaps maybe a former drug addict himself, it's not quite clear. But he wanted to establish a way to help people to, dope fiends at that time they called it, to get off of drugs. Of course, society had no programs at that time for drug addicts. You talk about being shunned, there was zero available. Makes sense, huh? Society as a whole would shun that type of activity, so treatment became darn near impossible. Well, Charles Dieterich decided to take some people into his apartment. He basically didn't have the proverbial pot to piss in, but he scrounged groceries from grocery stores in Southern California and took people in, and he developed what was called the Dieterich method of getting people unhooked from drugs. And it involved basically yelling and screaming and belittling each person in turn within a group setting. Yes, believe it or not, just doing everything short of beating someone to death and just belittling them to the extreme with yelling. And just, you can imagine being in a group of 4, 5, 10, 15 people, and everybody in turn has to take their licks at the old Dieterich method. And you can imagine sitting there waiting for your turn to come, and all you really want to do is get off the smack. But boy, you have to have a big psychological smack to do that. Well, believe it or not, he had some success with that method. And he called that Syanon, S-Y-A-N-O-N. The Syanon group was formed. And well, donations started to come in from everywhere. And in the early 60s was a real heyday. They started to purchase properties all throughout the West Coast and set up various branches of Syanon to help people get off of smack. Well, all good so far, right? Well, things took a very sinister turn. Come 1968, the group started to abandon their roots and became more cult-like in their approach to living on the properties and also for potential treatments. One of the very early communes, and the site that I'm standing now was one of the largest Syanon communities on the West Coast. People would come here, and by 1968, 1969, there was so much money pouring in, and there was so much success on this program that the influential, the bankers, the lawyers, the doctors, the cult followers, the people in Hollywood started to become very intrigued with this cult, and of course they themselves wanted to be followers and identified with it. It reached a point though where the members had to shave their heads and turn over their reproductive rights to the leadership of Syanon. It became a very difficult situation. Also, it became a mecca for runaway girls in particular would disappear and turn up here at Syanon. And in the late 1970s, the Point Reyes Lighthouse, the local newspaper, decided to launch an investigation into Syanon, and what they found was absolutely astounding. Well, they wouldn't have found as much as they did, but the owner, Charles Dieterich, decided to countersue. And in the course of that countersuit, we all know what Discovery is now on the bottom of YouTube. They came out and all kinds of recordings were found of the leadership ordering beatings and even murder of people. It was absolutely horrific. It got so bad that two members of this organization, Syanon, found 2 rattlesnakes, removed the rattles from them, and then stuck them in the mailboxes of the opposing council's homes. Well, you can imagine, well, one of them was terribly bitten, and he almost died. And the other one was lucky he was stopped from opening his mailbox before he could be bitten. Well, the Point Reyes Lighthouse newspaper won a Pulitzer Prize for its coverage. You can look it up. In 1978, the Cyanide Group was disbanded. Their properties were seized by the government, and eventually a private organization purchased this property and eventually turned it over to the state of California to operate the Marconi Center today. And every April 25th on Marconi's birthday, you can come here. They open up the facilities, the wireless transmitter operation at the governor's house, and you can watch them in action, sending and receiving signals. I think I'm going to try to come down next year and check it out. A very dark history here at the Marconi Wireless, Pacific Wireless Station. But one of the things that makes America so fascinating is not always a great story. It can be a pretty ugly story, too. Well, I'm going to get on my way to Point Reyes Station. I sure enjoyed my stop here at Marshall. Unfortunately, the center doesn't really open too many of the buildings for looky-loos like me. I hope you enjoyed a little look-through. I hope to get back here one day and check it out and really get the full measure of what it was all about. A great accomplished inventor, Marconi, his first Pacific wireless station. The glory of that. Can you imagine all the people on staff living here in this huge facility? It's as big as some hotels. I hope you noticed too, if you didn't, back up to the video where I walked around the perimeter of the porch there and peeked in. You could actually see some of the original wireless equipment mounted into the wall there. Okay, thanks for watching, everybody. Your thumbs up are appreciated, and let's get on with our trip.